1976 was supposed to be the year the American farmer finally won. Corn was king, land prices were skyrocketing, and the banks were practically begging men to borrow millions. In the sleepy county of Oak Haven, one man walked into the local diner with a briefcase full of contracts and a smile that could sell ice to a polar bear. He promised 12 prominent families a future of air-conditioned cabs and endless acreage. They called it the deal of the century. 40 years later, 11 of those families are gone, bankrupted, broken, and erased from the map. Only one man said no. This is the story of how a single signature cost a town its soul, and why the man who refused to sign is the only one left standing on his own dirt. The dust in Oak Haven, Nebraska didn't taste like dirt in the summer of 1976. It tasted like money. To understand why 12 sensible, hard-working men would eventually sign away their birthrights, you have to understand the air they were breathing. The mid-70s were a fever dream for American agriculture. The Soviet Union was buying grain by the boatload. Earl Boots, the Secretary of Agriculture, was shouting, "Get big or get out," from every radio station, and the price of an acre of farmland was climbing faster than a cornstalk in July. It was into this atmosphere of manic optimism that Gordon McElroy drove his pristine white Cadillac Eldorado. Gordon wasn't a local. He was a regional sales director for a massive dealership conglomerate out of Omaha called Mid-State Ag. He didn't look like a farmer. He wore tailored polyester suits, a gold watch that caught the sun like a heliograph, and he smelled of expensive cologne and freshly printed money. He wasn't there to sell a tractor. He was there to sell an empire. He set up his office in the back booth of Sally's Skillet, the diner where the county's biggest producers drank their morning coffee. He didn't approach them. He let the car out front do the talking. When the men came in, wiping grease from their hands, they saw the Cadillac and then they saw Gordon. Among the regulars were the Oak Haven 12, though they didn't have that name yet. They were the backbone of the county. There was Frank Sterling, a man who farmed 3,000 acres and had an ego to match. There was Tobias Halloway, a younger guy who had just taken over his daddy's spread and was desperate to prove he could modernize. And then there were the Miller brothers, Tom and Jerry, who competed with each other over everything from yield numbers to pickup trucks. Gordon McElroy played them like a fiddle. It started on a Tuesday. Frank Sterling was complaining about the heat in his cab. In 1976, air conditioning in tractors was becoming the new standard, but many were still sweating it out in open stations, or hot boxes. Gordon leaned over from his booth. "You know, Frank," he said, his voice smooth as butter, "the new John Deere 4630s just hit the lot in Omaha. Sound guard body, hydrostatic seat. You could wear a tuxedo in there and not break a sweat." Frank snorted. "And I'd have to sell a kidney to pay for it. Not with the way wheat is trading." Gordon countered, sliding a glossy brochure across the Formica table. It wasn't just a picture of a tractor. It was a picture of the future. The violently green paint, the yellow wheels, the promise of dominance. "The bank isn't looking at what you have, Frank. They're looking at what you could harvest if you had the horsepower. You're trying to farm 1976 land with 1960 iron. That's why you're tired." That was the hook. That's why you're tired. Over the next 3 weeks, Gordon McElroy didn't just sell equipment. He held court. He bought rounds of steak and eggs. He pulled out charts showing projected land values for 1980, 1985, 1990. The lines only went up. He spoke of leverage, as if it were a magical spell. He targeted the 12 specifically. He organized a private demonstration out at the Halloway place. Mid-State Ag trucked in 3 brand new beasts, a 443, OA463, O and the Monster, the 863, O four-wheel drive. When Tobias Halloway climbed into the cab of that 8630, closed the door and realized he couldn't hear the wind or the birds, just the low, confident hum of the diesel engine and the staticky classic rock on the AM radio. He was gone. He looked out over his fields through the curved glass and felt like a king. Gordon stood by the fence, watching. He knew the psychology of the American farmer better than he knew the machinery. He knew they were proud, competitive, and terrified of being left behind. "It's a package deal," Gordon told the group later that evening, leaning against the massive tire of the 4WD. "Midstate Org wants to make Oak Haven a showcase county. We upgrade the whole fleet. Tractors combines planters. We take your trade-in, sure, but we structure the financing against the projected land appreciation. You don't pay with cash flow, you pay with equity growth. The inflation pays the debt for you." It was financial gibberish, a house of cards, built on the assumption that the good times would never end. But standing there in the twilight, surrounded by the smell of diesel and the shiny green metal, it sounded like gospel. Frank Sterling was the first to crack. "I'm in," he said, spitting on the ground. "I'm not letting the damn neighbors out-farm me." Tobias followed. Then the Miller brothers. One by one the dominoes fell. They shook hands, they slapped backs. They laughed about how rich they were going to be. But there was one man who hadn't climbed into the cab. He hadn't eaten the steak and eggs. He hadn't even looked at the brochures. Caleb Stone stood at the back of the group, his arms crossed over a chest that was broad from lifting hay bales, not from puffing itself up with pride. Caleb was 45, but he looked older. He farmed 600 acres of prime bottomland that had been in his family since the Homestead Acts. He drove a 1964 John Deere 402 open station, no radio, just the wind and the noise. Gordon McElroy turned his winning smile toward the back of the crowd. He needed a clean sweep. 12 for 12. "What about you, Caleb?" Gordon asked, his voice echoing slightly in the evening air. "You ready to stop eating dust? I can put you in a 443. By Friday. Your land is paid off. You're sitting on a gold mine of equity. Let's put it to work." The other men turned to look at Caleb. The peer pressure was thick enough to cut with a knife. Caleb looked at the shiny 863, then at Gordon, and finally at his neighbors. He shifted his weight. "My 4020 runs fine," Caleb said quietly. "Runs fine." Frank Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Caleb, you're plowing 3 furrows while we're pulling 8. You're going to be left in the dust, literally." "Maybe," Caleb said. He looked Gordon dead in the eye. "But I own the 4020. Who owns that 8630, mister? McElroy, me, or the bank?" Gordon's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "The bank is a partner, Caleb, a partner in growth." "My daddy told me a partner who doesn't sweat in the field ain't a partner," Caleb replied. "He's a landlord waiting for you to miss a payment." The silence that followed was heavy. The spell wavered for a second, but only a second. Gordon laughed, breaking the tension. "Fair enough, Caleb. Some men like the past. We're talking about the future." He turned his back on Caleb, dismissing him. The other 11 men turned away, too, creating a closed circle of laughter and smoke. Caleb Stone was left standing alone in the twilight, the only man in Oak Haven who saw the shadow lurking behind the shine. The contracts were signed in early August of 1976. It was a ceremony, really. Gordon McElroy rented out the banquet hall at the local VFW. There was an open bar, a prime rib dinner, and a photographer from the county newspaper. The headline the next week read, "Oak Haven farmers gear up for the future." The photo showed the Oak Haven 12, minus Caleb Stone, of course, standing in a row shaking hands with Gordon and the bankers he had brought in from Omaha. They looked triumphant. They looked like tycoons. But the devil was in the details, buried in the fine print of the documents that stacked up on the tables like bricks. The deal Gordon had structured was complex. It was an equity-backed equipment lease. Essentially, the farmers weren't just taking out loans for the tractors. They were using their land titles as collateral to secure a revolving line of credit that would pay for the machinery, the fuel, and the expansion. The logic was circular. The new machinery would allow them to farm more land. To get more land, they had to bid high on rental acres. To pay for the rental acres and the machinery, they needed high grain prices and rising land values. If any one of those three pillars collapsed, grain prices, land values, or interest rates, the whole structure would come down. But in late 1976, nobody saw the collapse coming. Delivery Day was a spectacle. A convoy of flatbed trucks rolled into town carrying millions of dollars of green iron. It was like a parade. The kids ran out of the schoolhouse to watch. Tobias Halloway got his 86304 WD. He parked it on the hill overlooking the highway, so everyone driving by could see it. Frank Sterling got 2 463s and a brand new combine with a corn head that looked wide enough to swallow a house. For the first 6 months, it seemed like Caleb Stone was the fool. The fall harvest of 76 was a good one. The 12 tore through their fields with their new equipment. They harvested in record time. They sat in their air-conditioned cabs listening to the football games, drinking coffee from thermoses, while Caleb Stone was out there on his open station 4020, bundled up in a heavy Carhartt jacket against the biting November wind. His face caked in dust and chaff. They mocked him. It wasn't malicious at first, just the kind of ribbing that happens in small towns. At the feed store, Frank Sterling would loud talk when Caleb walked in. "Yeah, I finished the North 40 in about 4 hours yesterday. A sea was blowing so cold I had to turn it down. How's the windburn, Caleb?" The other men would chuckle. Caleb would just nod by his seed or his oil and walk out. He never argued. He never defended himself. He just kept working. But Caleb noticed things the others were too busy to see. He noticed that while the 12 were finishing harvest early, they were spending their extra time at the bank or meeting with Gordon McElroy about Phase 2, buying more land. Caleb stopped by the diner one morning and overheard Tobias Halloway talking to the banker. "I need to extend the line of credit for the fertilizer," Tobias was saying, his voice a little tight. "The fuel bill for that 8630 was higher than we thought." "That's fine, Toby," the banker said, smiling. "We'll just tack it onto the operating note. Your land value went up another 8% this quarter. You're good for it." You're good for it. That was the mantra. It didn't matter if they had cash, they had equity. They were rich on paper, but cash poor. Caleb, meanwhile, was debt-free. His 4020 was paid for. His combine was a 10-year-old gleaner that he fixed himself with a wrench and a curse word. When he harvested his crop, the money went into his savings account, not to a finance company in Omaha. Then came 1977. The first crack in the dam wasn't the prices, it was the weather. A mild drought hit the Midwest. Yields were down. Not a disaster, but a dip. For a farmer like Caleb, a dip meant you tightened your belt. You didn't buy a new truck. You ate more casseroles. You waited it out. But for the Oakhaven 12, a dip was a catastrophe. Their payments were fixed, and they were massive. The shiny green tractors required expensive parts, expensive specialized mechanics, and gallons upon gallons of diesel. The Sound Guard cabs were nice, but they didn't make the corn grow any better without rain. Gordon McElroy came back to town that winter. He wasn't driving the Cadillac this time. He was in a heavy-duty pickup looking serious. He gathered the 12 not at the diner, but in the boardroom of the local bank. Caleb heard about the meeting from the town gossip Mrs. Gable. They say Gordon is getting them to double down, Mrs. Gable whispered over the counter at the general store. He told them the only way to cover the shortfall from the drought is to expand even more. Economy of scale, he calls it. They're going to buy the chaotic spread over in the next county. Caleb shook his head. You can't borrow your way out of a drought, Mrs. Gable. Well, Frank Sterling says you're just jealous, she replied, though her eyes looked worried. He says you're farming in the Dark Ages. Dark Ages didn't have bankruptcy courts, Caleb muttered. The 12 took the bait again. They leveraged even deeper. They bought more land at inflated prices to justify the machinery they couldn't afford. They were running on a treadmill that was speeding up, terrified that if they stopped, they'd be thrown off. By 1978, the cracks were becoming visible chasms. Interest rates began to tick up. The Federal Reserve was getting nervous about inflation. The variable interest rates on the farmers' loans, which Gordon had assured them would stay low, started to climb. 7% became 9%. 9% became 11%. The shine was coming off the tractors. They were still green, but now they were covered in mud and grease. The payments were due every month, relentless as the tide. One evening in late 78, Caleb was in his barn, changing the oil in his 4020. The barn doors were open, letting in the cool night air. A truck pulled up the gravel drive. It was Tobias Halloway. Tobias looked 10 years older than he had 2 years ago. His eyes were rimmed with red. He walked into the barn, looking at the old 4020. She's still running, Tobias asked, his voice hollow. She runs, Caleb said, wiping his hands on a rag. What can I do for you, Toby? Tobias kicked at the dirt. I need to borrow your auger, Caleb. Mine's busted. The bearing seized up. The dealership says they can't get the part for 3 weeks, and even if they could, they want $800 for it. They won't let me put it on the account anymore. Said I'm overextended. Caleb looked at the young man. He saw the fear in his eyes. It was the fear of a man who realizes the trap has already snapped shut, and he's just now feeling the pain. Take the auger, Caleb said softly. I can pay you when the harvest check comes in, Tobias said quickly. Just take the auger, Toby. Bring it back when you're done. Tobias nodded, unable to meet Caleb's eyes. He loaded the old rusty piece of equipment into his truck, a truck the bank owned, and drove away. Caleb watched him go. He knew this was just the beginning. The storm was coming. The tractors, the land, the pride it was all about to be fed into the thresher, and Gordon McElroy, he was nowhere to be found. If 1976 was the party, 1979 was the hangover. But nobody knew just how bad the headache was going to be until a Saturday night in October. That was the night Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, went on television and effectively declared war on inflation. To kill the inflation that was eating the dollar, he decided to strangle the money supply. Interest rates, which had already been creeping up, didn't just climb, they skyrocketed. In Oak Haven, the news didn't hit immediately. It trickled in through the mail slots of the farmhouses, hidden inside innocuous white envelopes from the bank. Frank Sterling was the first to feel the blade. It was a Tuesday morning in early 1980. Frank was sitting at his kitchen table, a place that used to be the command center of his empire. Now it was cluttered with overdue notices and unopened bills. He slit open the letter from First National Bank of Oak Haven. He read it once. Then he cleaned his glasses and read it again. His operating loan, the massive multi-million-dollar line of credit that Gordon McElroy had set up to float his expansion, was tied to the prime rate plus 2%. When he signed the papers in 76, the rate was 7%. The letter in his hand stated in cold, impartial type that effective immediately, his interest rate was adjusting to 19.5%. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. He did the math in his head, the numbers tumbling over each other. At 7%, his interest payment was manageable, covered by a good harvest. At nearly 20%, the interest alone was more than his entire projected gross profit for the year. He would be losing money just by waking up in the morning. He drove to the bank in a rage. He didn't take the Cadillac. He took the farm truck, slamming the door so hard the rust flaked off the rocker panels. The bank lobby was quiet. The teller's girls who had grown up in the town wouldn't look him in the eye. They knew. Everyone knew. Frank barged into the office of Lawrence P. Higgins, the bank president. Lawrence was a man Frank had known since high school, a man who had eaten at Frank's table. "What the hell is this, Larry?" Frank slammed the letter onto the mahogany desk. 19%. That's usury. That's loan shark numbers. Lawrence didn't stand up. He looked tired, his face grey and drawn. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "It's the Fed, Frank. It's the prime rate. Our cost of borrowing went up, so yours has to go up. It's in the contract." "The contract," Frank roared. "The contract Gordon McElroy said was a formality. You told me land values would cover it. You told me equity was king. Land values are softening, Frank," Lawrence said quietly. "And grain prices. Well, you heard about the embargo. That was the second blow. President Carter had just embargoed grain sales to the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. The massive market that Gordon McElroy had promised would buy every bushel you can grow had vanished overnight. Corn prices were in free fall. "I can't pay this," Frank whispered, the rage suddenly replaced by a cold, hollow terror. "Larry, if I pay this rate, I can't buy seed for planting. I can't buy diesel." Lawrence Higgins looked out the window at the town square. "Then we have a problem, Frank, because if you can't service the debt, the regulators make us classify the loan as non-performing. And if it's non-performing..." He didn't have to finish the sentence. Foreclosure. While the 12 panicked, Caleb Stone was out in his machine shed. The atmosphere on Caleb's farm was different. It was quiet. Peaceful even. He wasn't rich. The drop in grain prices hurt him too. He would make less money this year, which meant he wouldn't be painting the barn or buying that new recliner his wife wanted. But that was it. He had no interest payments. He had no variable rate triggers. Caleb was rebuilding the carburetor on his 4020. He worked slowly, his calloused fingers handling the tiny brass needles with surprising delicacy. The radio was playing in the background, a low murmur of bad news that couldn't touch him. He heard tires on gravel. He looked up to see Jerry Miller, the younger of the Miller brothers, walking into the shed. Jerry looked like a ghost. He had lost 30 pounds. His clothes hung off him like they belonged to a bigger man. Jerry watched Caleb work for a long time without speaking. The smell of gasoline and solvent hung in the air. "You need a hand?" Jerry asked, finally, his voice cracking. "Just finishing up," Caleb said. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Coffee." They sat on 2 overturned buckets near the door. Jerry held the mug of black coffee with both hands, trying to stop them from shaking. "They're calling the note Caleb," Jerry whispered. "Mid-State Ag. They sent a rep out yesterday. Not Gordon. Some new guy in a suit. Said our collateral-to-debt ratio is underwater. They want additional security." "Additional security?" Caleb asked. "They want the deed to my mum's house." Jerry said, tears welling up in his eyes. "The house she lives in. It wasn't part of the original deal, but the fine print says they can demand more collateral if land values drop. If I don't sign it over, they repossess the tractors and foreclose on the 800 acres. Caleb stared out at the grey winter sky. The trap was so vicious, so perfect. "Don't give them your mum's house, Jerry." "If I don't, we lose everything," Jerry cried out, the desperation spilling over. "The 4630s, the combine, the land, everything we worked for." "You already lost it, Jerry," Caleb said, his voice gentle but unyielding. "The math doesn't work at 20% interest. If you give them the house, they'll take the farm and the house in 6 months. Save what you can." Jerry stood up, trembling with anger. "You don't understand. You're sitting here with your junk equipment and your small patch of dirt. You don't know what it's like to play in the big leagues. I know I'm sleeping at night," Caleb said. Jerry stormed out. He signed the papers the next day, putting his mother's house up as collateral. He thought he was buying time. He was only buying a front-row seat to his own funeral. By 1982, the Oak Haven 12 were no longer a group of proud, ambitious men. They were a statistic. The land values didn't just soften, they cratered. As interest rates stayed high, nobody could afford to buy land, so the market collapsed. Land that was valued at $3,000 an acre in 1976 was now worth $1,200. This created the death spiral. The farmers owed millions based on the $3,000 valuation. Now that the land was worth half, that the bank was technically insolvent on those loans. The bank had no choice. They had to liquidate. The first domino to fall was Tobias Halloway. Tobias had been the most eager, the one who bought the giant 86304 WD to impress his neighbors. Now he was the first to be carved up. The auction took place on a damp, grey Tuesday in March. It wasn't a celebration. It felt like a public execution. The driveway to the Halloway place was lined with pickup trucks for a mile. They came from 3 counties over. Some were vultures, bargain hunters looking to pick the bones of a dead farm. Others were neighbors there to pay their respects, terrified that they were next. Caleb Stone parked his truck at the end of the line and walked up the long driveway. The mud sucked at his boots. The air smelled of wet wool and tobacco smoke. In the center of the yard, the machinery was lined up. The green paint of the John Deere 8630 was faded, now scratched from years of hard use, a hydraulic hose leaking a dark puddle onto the gravel. It didn't look like the future anymore. It looked like a shackles. Tobias was nowhere to be seen. He was inside the house, with the curtains drawn, unable to watch. His wife stood on the porch, holding their youngest child, her face a mask of stone. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man from the city who didn't know the land or the people, climbed onto the back of a flatbed truck. The microphone squealed. "All right, folks, listen up. We got a lot of iron to move today. Bank-ordered liquidation. Everything sells. No reserves." The cruelty of no reserves hung in the air. It meant if a tractor worth $50,000 brought a bid of $10, it sold for $10. They started with the small stuff. Tools, welders, the shop air compressor. Caleb watched as men bought Tobias's life for pennies on the dollar. A socket set Tobias had received as a graduation gift sold for $5. Then came the big iron. "Item number 42, the auctioneer bellowed. 1976, John Deere 8630, 4-wheel drive, the big horse. Who'll start me at 50,000? Do I hear 50? Silence. The crowd shuffled. 50,000 was a joke. Nobody had money. 40-30. Come on, boys, this machine cost 80 grand, no? Still silence. The wind whistled through the cab of the tractor. 10,000, a voice called out from the back. It was a salvage buyer from Iowa, a man who stripped tractors for parts. I have 10. Do I hear 12? Frank Sterling was standing near the front. He looked at the tractor. It was identical to the machines he had. He knew that if this tractor sold for 10,000, his tractors were only worth 10,000. His net worth was evaporating in real time before his eyes. Sold. For $10,000 to the man in the yellow hat. A gasp went through the crowd. A machine that had symbolized the pinnacle of success 6 years ago had just sold for scrap value. Then came the land. This was the part that broke hearts. The Halloway farm had been in the family for 3 generations. The auctioneer held up the plat map. 320 acres of prime bottomland. Who wants it? The bidding was sluggish. The corporate investors weren't interested yet. They were waiting for the bottom. The locals were broke. Finally, an insurance company from Hartford, Connecticut, bought the land via a telephone bid. They bought it as a tax write-off. They would rent it out to the highest bidder and never set foot on it. As the gavel banged down, finalizing the sale of the land, the front door of the house opened. Tobias stumbled out. He was drunk, stumbling, shouting at the crowd. "Get off my land! Get out of here, vultures! You're all vultures." The sheriff, a man who had played high school football with Tobias, stepped forward. He put a gentle hand on Tobias's shoulder. "Come on, Toby, let's go back inside." "It's Gordon." Tobias screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Where is he? Where's the man who told me I'd be rich? Where is he?" Caleb Stone watched from the edge of the crowd. He felt a heavy, crushing sadness in his chest. He wasn't happy to be right. There was no victory in this. He saw Frank Sterling standing near the fence. Frank was trembling. He was watching his own future play out. Caleb walked over to Frank. They hadn't spoken more than a few words in 2 years. "Frank," Caleb said softly. Frank turned. His eyes were wild, panic-stricken. "They took it, Caleb. They took it all. For nothing." "Go home, Frank," Caleb said. "Hug your wife. Don't let them take you too." Frank looked at Caleb, and for the first time, the arrogance was gone. "I can't go home, Caleb. The bank called this morning. They're coming for me next month. I'm next." The auction ended as the rain began to fall, a cold, miserable drizzle that soaked the Oakhaven 12 to the bone. They dispersed, heading back to their trucks, back to their kitchen tables, to stare at the piles of debt that were now insurmountable. Caleb Stone drove his truck back to his farm. He pulled into his lane. His 4020 was parked, under the shed paid for. His land was his. But as he looked out over his fields, the silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt lonely. The community was dying, and he was the only survivor on a sinking ship. And the worst part, Gordon McElroy was still out there somewhere, probably selling the same dream to a new group of men in a different county, driving a newer Cadillac, leaving the wreckage of Oakhaven in his rearview mirror. The winter of 1984 was the coldest on record in Oakhaven. The snow drifted 6 feet high against the fences, burying the rusted machinery that littered the county like the bones of dead dinosaurs. By now, 10 of the 12 had fallen. They had vanished into rental houses in the city, or taken jobs as truck drivers, or simply disappeared into the bottle. Only Frank Sterling and the Miller brothers were left hanging on by a thread that was fraying with every collection call. But Frank Sterling wasn't just hanging on. He was digging in. Frank had stopped answering the phone months ago. He had stopped opening his mail. When the sheriff's deputy came to serve the eviction notice, the final decree that his 3,000 acres, his house and his barns were now the property of the Federal Land Bank. Frank met him at the cattle guard with a 12-gauge shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. "Turn around, Jimmy," Frank had said, his voice flat and dead. "You grew up on this road. Don't make me do it." The deputy, a young kid named Jimmy Weaver, had reversed his patrol car and called the state police. That was how the standoff began. For 3 days, the Sterling farm was a fortress. The state troopers set up a perimeter at the end of the long driveway. The news vans arrived from Omaha, their satellite dishes pointed at the farmhouse like accusing fingers. They called it the Farmer's Last Stand. Caleb Stone watched it on the small color TV in his kitchen. He saw the helicopter shots of Frank's farm. He saw the empty feed bunks. He saw the two massive 463 tractors parked in front of the porch, serving as a barricade. On the third night, the phone rang at Caleb's house. It was Sheriff Miller, no relation to the brothers. "Caleb," the sheriff said, his voice ragged. "He's asking for you. The negotiators can't get through to him. He says the only honest man left in this county is Caleb Stone. Will you come?" Caleb didn't hesitate. He put on his coat, walked out into the biting wind, and drove his truck through the police barricade. The walk up the driveway was the longest of Caleb's life. The snow crunched loudly under his boots. The tactical lights from the police cruisers cast long, terrifying shadows against the white farmhouse. Caleb walked past the green tractors. They were covered in snow, their tires flat, their cabs dark. They looked like giant dead insects. He stepped onto the porch. "Frank," he called out softly. "It's Caleb." The door creaked open. Frank was sitting in the hallway on a wooden chair. The shotgun was on the floor, broken open, empty. Frank looked like a skeleton. His eyes were sunken, his skin grey. He hadn't shaved in weeks. The house was freezing. The power had been cut days ago. "I thought about shooting them, Caleb," Frank whispered, staring at the wall. "I really did. I thought if I took a few of them with me, maybe people would understand." Caleb sat on the floor opposite him. "They wouldn't understand, Frank. They'd just call you crazy. They wouldn't see the theft. They'd just see the violence." Frank looked at Caleb, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "I did everything he said. Gordon. He said leverage was the key. He said I was building a legacy. Look at it, Caleb. Look at my legacy." He gestured around the dark, freezing house. The wallpaper was peeling. The silence was absolute. "Gordon didn't sell you a legacy, Frank," Caleb said, his voice low and devoid of judgment. "He sold you a dream. And dreams always wake up." "Why didn't you sign?" Frank asked a question that had been burning a hole in him for 8 years. "Why were you the only one?" Caleb looked at his hands, hands that were rough-scarred but his own. "Because I never wanted to be a king, Frank. I just wanted to be a farmer. A king has to expand his borders. A farmer just has to tend his soil." Frank slumped. The fight went out of him all at once, like air leaving a punctured tire. "I don't know where to go, Caleb. I don't know how to be anything else." "You come stay with me for a while," Caleb said, standing up and offering a hand. "We'll figure it out. But you have to walk out of here. Don't let them carry you out." Frank Sterling, the man who once bragged he would own the whole county, took Caleb's hand. He stood up, trembling, and walked out into the blinding glare of the police spotlights. He left the farm, the land, and the tractors behind. He walked away with nothing but the clothes on his back and his life. The twist that no one saw coming didn't happen in a field. It happened in a boardroom in Washington, D.C., 6 months later. The First National Bank of Oak Haven, the institution that had funded the 12, the bank that had eagerly handed out millions of dollars based on Gordon McElroy's inflated projections, collapsed. It was a domino effect. When farmers like Frank Sterling and Tobias Halloway defaulted, the bank's assets turned into worthless paper. The bank was insolvent. The FDIC moved in on a Friday afternoon and locked the doors. Suddenly, the owners of the land weren't the local bankers anymore. The deeds to half the county were held by the federal government, dumped into a massive liquidation pool. This was the moment Caleb Stone had been saving for. Not with greed, but with patience. For 8 years, Caleb had put his harvest money into treasury bonds. He had driven his old truck. He had fixed his old tractor. He had lived like a pauper while his neighbors lived like princes. Now cash was not just king. It was God. Caleb walked into the temporary federal office set up in the county courthouse. He asked about the sterling parcel, the 40 acres surrounding Frank's old farmhouse. He didn't want the 3,000 acres of cropland. The corporate vultures were already circling that carcass. He just wanted the house and the small pasture around it. The federal agent looked at the file. "It's a distressed asset. We're looking to offload it quickly. Make an offer." Caleb made an offer. It was insulting. It was pennies on the dollar. It was the amount of cash he had in his savings account. The agent stamped the paper. Sold. That afternoon, Caleb drove to the small rental apartment where Frank Sterling and his wife were living. Frank was working as a greeter at a Walmart in the next town over, wearing a blue vest that looked wrong on his broad shoulders. Caleb laid the deed on the table. "What's this?" Frank asked, wiping his glasses. "I bought the house, Frank," Caleb said, "and the 40 acres around it." Frank's face went pale. You bought my house?" "I bought it so the corporations wouldn't bulldoze it," Caleb said. "It's yours to live in. You pay me rent when you can. If you can't, you don't." "But it's your home." Frank Sterling broke down. The man who had once mocked Caleb for his peasant farming lay his head on the table and wept. 2 years later, in 1986, Caleb was at the gas station, filling up his 4.020. The crisis was technically over, but the landscape had changed forever. The family farms were gone, replaced by massive corporate operations managed by men in distant cities. A car pulled up to the pump opposite him. It wasn't a Cadillac this time. It was a beat-up Ford Taurus, rusted around the wheel wells, the engine knocking. The driver got out. He looked older, grayer, his suit frayed at the cuffs. He looked tired. It was Gordon McElroy. Caleb froze. He hadn't seen Gordon in 10 years. The man who had destroyed Oak Haven was standing 10 feet away, pumping $5 of regular unleaded. Gordon looked up and locked eyes with Caleb. He paused the nozzle in his hand. He squinted, trying to place the face. "Do I know you?" Gordon asked. His voice had lost that smooth, radio-quality timbre. It sounded scratchy and desperate. Caleb looked at him. He thought about shouting. He thought about hitting him. He thought about telling him that Tobias Halloway had died of a heart attack at 42, or that the Miller brothers no longer spoke to each other. But as he looked at Gordon, Caleb realized the man didn't remember. To Gordon, Oak Haven was just another pin on a map, another commission check long since spent. Gordon was a ghost, haunting a world he didn't understand. Probably broke, probably driving to the next town to try and sell a new lie. "No," Caleb said quietly. "You don't know me. I'm just a farmer." Gordon shrugged, uninterested. "Right. Nice tractor. Those old 4020s run forever, don't they?" "They do," Caleb said, "if you take care of them." Gordon got back in his rusted Ford and drove away, disappearing down the highway, a small, insignificant speck in the vast Nebraska landscape. Caleb climbed into the open station of his tractor. He fired up the engine. The diesel smoke puffed into the blue sky, the sound a steady, rhythmic heartbeat. He put it in gear and drove back toward his land, the land that was still his, the dirt that held no debt, the only kingdom that mattered. The 12 were gone. The dealer was a drifter, but the farmer remained. In the end, the story of the Oak Haven 12 isn't just about tractors or interest rates. It's a tragedy about the seduction of more. It's about how easily we can be convinced that what we have isn't enough, and that the future is something we can buy on credit. Gordon McElroy was a villain, yes, but he was also a mirror. He showed those men their own greed and insecurity. Caleb Stone survived not because he was smarter or because he was a better farmer, but because he knew the one thing the others forgot. Contentment is the only true wealth. While the others tried to own the world and lost everything, Caleb was content to own his own soul, and in doing so, he ended up being the only one left standing on his own ground. I hope this story hit you as hard as it hit me. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the slow lane is the only one that leads home. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the 1980s farm crisis and the story of Caleb Stone, please hit that like button. It really helps get these stories out to more people. And I want to know from you, do you have a story in your family about a deal of the century that went wrong? Or maybe a time when saying no was the best decision you ever made? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss our next story. Thanks for watching, and keep your boots on the ground.